Nobody on Flight 892 paid any attention to the young woman in seat 18B until she became their only hope for survival. Elena Rodriguez seemed like just another traveler, passenger 91 on the manifest, quietly reading a book while sipping tea as the Airbus A330 cruised smoothly at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic. But when disaster struck and left the cockpit crew helpless, the military escort jets flanking their aircraft would soon discover why call signs Storm had once been whispered with deep respect in Air Force bases across 4 continents. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin of Lufthansa Flight 892 as it began its descent toward Frankfurt International Airport. It was meant to be a routine transatlantic crossing, one of hundreds that happened every day, carrying business travelers, families, and tourists across the ocean without incident. The Airbus A330 had departed Boston Logan International Airport exactly on time, its 298 passengers settling into the familiar rhythm of long-haul travel. In the cockpit, Captain Klaus Müller and First Officer Lisa Weber were running through their standard pre-descent procedures. Müller, a 25-year veteran with Lufthansa, had flown this route over 1,200 times. The weather was perfect, clear skies, minimal turbulence, with Frankfurt reporting excellent visibility and light winds. It was the kind of day that made flying feel almost routine. The passenger manifest showed the usual mix of international travelers. Business executives in first class worked on laptops, preparing for Monday morning meetings. Families in economy dealt with restless children who had grown tired of the 9-hour journey. Students backpacked across continents, sleeping against windows or watching movies on their phones. Elderly couples shared travel stories, while solo travelers like Elena kept to themselves. Elena Rodriguez appeared unremarkable in every way that mattered to casual observers. Listed simply as E. Rodriguez, seated in 18B, the young woman in her late 20s had an understated presence that made her blend seamlessly into any crowd. Her black hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and comfortable running shoes that suggested someone who valued practicality over fashion. Nothing about her suggested military service or aviation experience. Throughout the flight, Elena had been the perfect passenger in every respect. She had politely declined the meal service with a quiet smile, read from a well-worn technical manual that most passengers would have found incomprehensible, and caused no disturbance to her fellow travelers. The flight attendants barely noticed her except to offer standard service, which she accepted with a quiet "thank you," spoken in lightly accented English that hinted at Latin American origins but revealed nothing more about her background. What nobody realized was that Elena's eyes had been tracking far more than the pages of her book. Every 20 minutes, she glanced at her watch, not from impatience or anxiety about arrival times, but from deeply ingrained habit. She noted the flight attendants' locations during their service routines, observed the behavior of nervous passengers with the detached interest of someone trained in human behavior assessment, and unconsciously catalogued the aircraft's sounds and movements with the automatic awareness of an expert. The book in her hands, a technical manual on advanced flight systems, was heavily annotated with notes written in precise handwriting. Between the complex diagrams were subtle annotations in 3 different languages, coded reminders that would mean nothing to a casual observer but everything to someone who understood operational security protocols and combat aviation procedures. What none of the passengers, crew members, or even the airline's security screening could see was the extraordinary person beneath the carefully maintained, unremarkable exterior. Elena's quiet confidence wasn't the result of natural shyness or introversion. It was the controlled awareness of someone who had been trained to observe rather than be observed, to assess situations while remaining invisible to potential threats. Her steady hands weren't just naturally calm under pressure, they were hands that had operated the most complex aircraft systems under extreme combat conditions, hands that had maintained precise control while missiles exploded around her aircraft and enemy fighters tried to shoot her down. Her alert eyes weren't merely the result of natural intelligence, they were eyes that had seen air-to-air combat over hostile territory and learned to read tactical situations that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Born in Caracas to a Venezuelan mother who worked as a civil engineer and a Colombian father who served as a commercial airline pilot, Elena had grown up trilingual and multicultural, moving between different worlds with an adaptability that would later prove invaluable in her military career. Her childhood had been relatively normal by most standards, good grades in school, a few close friends, and a passionate love of aviation sparked by regular visits to her uncle, a retired Venezuelan Air Force pilot who filled her young mind with stories of flight and aerial combat. Her family had expected her to follow a conventional path into civilian engineering or medicine, fields that seemed to match her analytical abilities and quiet intelligence. Instead, at 19 she surprised everyone by enrolling in the Colombian Air Force Academy, choosing a demanding path that would transform her from an unassuming young woman into one of Latin America's most skilled and decorated combat pilots. The Colombian Air Force had initially shared her family's doubts about her suitability for military aviation. Flight training was notoriously demanding both physically and mentally, with a dropout rate that eliminated most candidates before they ever reached advanced aircraft. Elena's instructors had looked at her during those first weeks of training and wondered privately if she possessed the commanding presence and aggressive personality they traditionally associated with successful military pilots. They had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. While her male classmates relied on physical aggression and vocal bravado to demonstrate their suitability for combat aviation, Elena succeeded through precision, intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to understand complex aircraft systems. She consistently outflew candidates who were taller, stronger, and considerably louder, earning her wings through sheer skill, determination, and a deep understanding of aerodynamics that impressed even her most skeptical instructors. Her flight training performance had been exceptional by any measure. She mastered advanced maneuvers faster than candidates with twice her physical size, demonstrated better situational awareness under simulated combat conditions, and showed an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that usually took years to develop. More importantly, she possessed something that couldn't be taught in any flight school: the ability to remain completely calm and analytical under extreme pressure while making split-second decisions that could determine the outcome of life-and-death situations. After earning her commission as a second lieutenant, Elena had been selected for international exchange programs, flying missions across South America and participating in joint exercises with U.S. Air Force, Brazilian Air Force, and European military forces. She had piloted everything from transport aircraft to advanced fighter jets, accumulating flight hours and commendations that would have made pilots twice her age envious. Her call sign, Storm, had been earned during a classified counter-narcotics operation over the Colombian jungle, where she successfully completed a critical reconnaissance mission after her aircraft suffered severe damage from concentrated ground fire. Despite losing primary flight controls, dealing with multiple system failures, and flying with significant structural damage, she had managed to gather essential intelligence data and return to base safely, saving both her aircraft and mission-critical information that led to the disruption of a major drug trafficking network. The mission had been so highly classified that even now, years after its completion, the specific details remained locked away in military archives accessible only to personnel with the highest security clearances. What was known among the international military aviation community was that Captain Elena Rodriguez had demonstrated flying skills under combat conditions that bordered on the impossible. Now at 28, Elena was navigating the complex transition from active military service to civilian aviation, taking what she diplomatically described to her family as time to explore commercial flying opportunities. The reality was considerably more complicated than her modest explanation suggested. Recent budget cuts and political changes had reduced advancement opportunities within the Colombian Air Force, particularly for pilots from middle-class backgrounds who lacked the political connections that increasingly influenced promotion decisions. Elena had reached a point where her exceptional flying skills and combat record weren't sufficient to guarantee continued career progression within the military hierarchy. This flight to Frankfurt was part of a carefully planned exploration of civilian aviation opportunities. She had meetings scheduled with several major European airlines and aerospace companies over the following week, interviews that might determine whether her future lay in commercial aviation, private security flying, or perhaps a return to military service with a different air force that might better value her unique capabilities. The transition process had proven more frustrating than she had anticipated. During preliminary interviews with European airlines over the past 2 months, she had encountered a consistent pattern of polite interest followed by gentle redirection toward positions that seemed to undervalue her extensive experience and proven capabilities. At KLM's Amsterdam headquarters, the chief pilot had spent most of their meeting explaining how different civilian flying was from military operations, as if her 3,200 flight hours in advanced military aircraft somehow made her less qualified to handle commercial aviation challenges. "It's about passenger confidence," he had said, his eyes lingering on her small frame. "People want to see someone who looks like they can handle any situation." Air France had been more diplomatically dismissive, suggesting she might want to gain experience, on domestic routes before considering international wide-body operations routes. She was vastly overqualified to fly based on her military experience with aircraft far more complex than any civilian airliner. At 2:47 p.m. local time, Flight 892 was 18 minutes from its scheduled arrival at Frankfurt International Airport when Captain Mueller keyed his microphone to begin the standard pre-landing announcement that he had delivered thousands of times during his career. "Ladies and gentlemen from the flight deck, we're beginning our descent into Frankfurt International Airport. Weather conditions are excellent with clear skies and light winds. We should have you on the ground right on schedule at gate B24. The announcement was delivered in the calm, professional tone that passengers expected from airline captains, and this afternoon felt no different from countless other transatlantic crossings. The Airbus A330 was performing perfectly according to all instrument readings, and the approach into Frankfurt was proceeding exactly as planned. First Officer Weber was updating the flight management system with current weather data from Frankfurt Approach Control when she noticed the first anomaly, a subtle vibration in the airframe that lasted barely 3 seconds before returning to normal. She immediately glanced at the engine parameters on her display, but all readings appeared completely normal. "Klaus, did you feel that vibration about 30 seconds ago?" she asked Captain Mueller, using his first name according to the informal communication style common among experienced crews who had flown together for years. Mueller nodded immediately, having noticed the same unusual sensation. "I felt it too. All parameters look good though. Probably just a momentary turbulence pocket. These Atlantic crossings sometimes have isolated atmospheric bumps even in apparently clear conditions." He performed a quick but thorough visual scan of all primary flight instruments, confirming that engine temperatures, hydraulic pressures, and electrical system readings were all within normal operational ranges. The aircraft was behaving exactly as it should during a routine descent toward a major international airport. What neither pilot could have realized was that the momentary vibration was actually the first symptom of a catastrophic structural failure developing deep within the aircraft's wing assembly. A microscopic crack in a critical wing spar, completely undetectable during routine maintenance inspections, had been growing gradually over hundreds of flight cycles, weakened by the repeated stress of pressurization cycles and normal flight operations. The crack had finally reached a critical size where the metal structure could no longer handle the aerodynamic loads being placed on it during normal flight operations. At 2:49 p.m., the hairline crack became a complete structural failure that would change everything. The wing spar separation happened in milliseconds, but its effects cascaded through multiple aircraft systems with devastating speed that caught both pilots completely unprepared. The structural failure caused immediate and severe damage to fuel lines, hydraulic systems, and electrical conduits running through the wing structure. Within seconds, the aircraft began experiencing a cascade of system failures that transformed the quiet, professional flight deck environment into chaos. The first indication in the cockpit was a violent shudder that seemed to shake the entire aircraft from nose to tail, followed immediately by a series of warning lights and electronic alarms that turned the previously peaceful afternoon flight into an emergency that would test every skill and piece of training the experienced crew possessed. "Master warning. Master caution," Weber called out, her voice sharp with sudden adrenaline as emergency displays illuminated across the cockpit instrument panel. "We're showing multiple hydraulic system failures, fuel system malfunction, and electrical problems across primary and backup systems." Before Mueller could formulate a response to the rapidly developing emergency, the situation became exponentially worse. The structural damage was so severe that it had compromised the aircraft's primary and backup flight control systems simultaneously. The Airbus A330 sophisticated fly-by-wire control system, normally stable and predictable, began reporting that primary flight controls weren't responding properly to pilot inputs. Mueller immediately took manual control and fought against the flight controls as the aircraft began an uncommanded roll to the right that threatened to develop into an unrecoverable spiral. The advanced electronic flight system that made modern airliners safe and manageable was failing catastrophically, leaving the experienced pilots with an aircraft that suddenly seemed determined to tear itself apart in midair. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Mueller transmitted on the international emergency frequency, his voice maintaining professional composure despite the life-threatening crisis unfolding around them. "Lufthansa 892 Heavy, we are experiencing multiple system failures and possible structural damage. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by." The response from Frankfurt Approach Control was immediate and professional, but couldn't address the fundamental problem they were facing. Flight 892 was 18 minutes from Frankfurt with 298 souls on board, and the aircraft was rapidly becoming completely uncontrollable using conventional flight procedures. In the main passenger cabin, the violent shaking and sudden, uncontrolled altitude changes had triggered widespread panic among the travelers who had been peacefully preparing for landing just minutes earlier. Oxygen masks dropped automatically from overhead compartments as the aircraft's damaged systems interpreted the erratic flight behavior as a potential rapid decompression event. Passengers screamed in terror as carry-on luggage fell from overhead storage bins and the aircraft pitched and rolled in violent, unnatural ways that passenger jets were never designed to perform. The normal sounds of commercial flight, quiet conversation, electronic devices, air conditioning systems, had been completely replaced by emergency alarms, harsh red lighting, and the kind of raw fear that comes when people suddenly realize they might be experiencing their final minutes of life. Children were crying uncontrollably, adults were praying in multiple languages, and flight attendants were shouting emergency instructions while trying to maintain their own composure in a situation that was clearly beyond anything covered in their extensive safety training. But in seat 18B, Elena Rodriguez was making rapid calculations and technical assessments that had absolutely nothing to do with standard passenger emergency procedures. Her trained ear had immediately recognized the specific sound signature of major structural failure, not just routine mechanical problems, but the kind of catastrophic metal separation that could compromise multiple aircraft systems simultaneously and make the aircraft essentially unflyable using normal techniques. Her experienced eyes tracked the aircraft's unusual movements with professional detachment, mentally cataloging control responses that suggested not just hydraulic system failure, but probable flight control system damage that would require extraordinary piloting techniques to overcome. While other passengers prayed, panicked, or prepared for what seemed like inevitable death, Elena was systematically reviewing advanced emergency procedures for exactly this type of multiple system failure scenario. That study was about to become critically relevant, because in the cockpit, Captain Mueller and First Officer Weber were discovering that their aircraft was beyond the scope of standard emergency procedures. "Lisa, I can't control the bank angle," Mueller said through gritted teeth, using both hands and significant physical strength just to prevent the aircraft from entering an uncontrolled roll that would quickly become unrecoverable. "The primary flight controls aren't responding properly, and we're losing system pressure across multiple hydraulic circuits." Weber was working frantically through multiple emergency checklists simultaneously, but the combination of system failures they were experiencing wasn't covered by any single standard procedure. Multiple critical systems were failing faster than they could respond to individual problems, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable and uncontrollable with each passing second. Elena made a decision that would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew her only as the quiet passenger in seat 18B. She unbuckled her seatbelt and began making her way forward through the chaotic cabin toward the cockpit area, moving with the confident, balanced stride of someone who remained completely stable despite the aircraft's violent and unpredictable movements. Senior Flight Attendant Thomas Braun intercepted her with professional authority. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat immediately and fasten your seatbelt. We're experiencing a serious emergency situation, and all passengers must remain seated with their seatbelts securely fastened according to safety regulations." Elena looked directly at Braun with calm, steady eyes that seemed completely out of place amid the chaos and terror surrounding them throughout the cabin. "Sir, I need to speak with Captain Mueller immediately. I'm a military pilot with extensive experience in aircraft emergency situations involving multiple system failures, and I believe I may be able to provide assistance that could save this aircraft and everyone on board." Elena moved past the flight attendant with fluid confidence and approached the reinforced cockpit door. The door was locked according to Post 9/11 security protocols, but Braun's master key opened it to reveal Captain Mueller and First Officer Weber in the middle of what appeared to be a desperate, losing battle with their aircraft. "Captain Mueller," Elena announced herself clearly, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms, radio chatter, and system warnings. "I'm Captain Elena Rodriguez, Colombian Air Force. I have extensive experience with multiple system aircraft failures under combat conditions, and I believe I can assist with your current emergency situation." Mueller's initial reaction was a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your offer to help, but this is not the appropriate time for..." "Captain, you're dealing with catastrophic structural failure that has compromised multiple primary flight systems simultaneously," Elena interrupted with calm authority, her trained eyes quickly scanning the cockpit instrument displays. "Your immediate concern should be preventing the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable attitude while maintaining sufficient control authority to reach a suitable landing location." Weber looked up from her emergency checklist, genuinely surprised by the technical accuracy and professional terminology. How do you know our current system status and flight condition? Because I can read your instrument displays and I've been monitoring your radio communications with approach control. More importantly, I've trained extensively for exactly this type of emergency scenario. You're attempting to use standard Airbus emergency procedures, but this particular failure combination requires manual flight techniques that go beyond conventional civilian pilot training programs. Mueller was about to dismiss her claims again when the aircraft suddenly pitched into an even steeper dive, forcing him to use both hands and considerable physical strength just to prevent complete loss of control. The standard recovery techniques taught in civilian flight training weren't working, and his available options were rapidly diminishing with each passing second. What specific manual flight techniques are you referring to? Weber asked, desperation beginning to creep into her previously professional composure. Elena moved closer to the central instrument console, her experienced eyes scanning the flight instruments and system displays with the practiced efficiency of someone who could read complex aircraft systems as easily as most people read newspapers. You're fighting against the aircraft instead of working with the remaining functional systems. In a situation like this, you need to use asymmetric thrust management combined with differential rudder and spoiler inputs to maintain directional control, while using pitch trim adjustments to manage aircraft attitude instead of trying to force unresponsive primary flight controls. Your engines can provide both forward propulsion and directional control if you manage the individual power settings correctly, Elena explained, positioning herself where she could reach both the engine thrust levers and the remaining functional flight controls. Combined with careful use of whatever flight control surfaces are still responding, you can essentially fly the aircraft like a large fighter jet with extensive battle damage. I've successfully recovered aircraft using these techniques before. Mueller looked at Elena, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to desperate hope. Can you actually help us regain meaningful control of this aircraft? I can attempt it, but I'll need direct access to the flight controls, and you'll need to trust techniques that aren't covered in standard civilian operating procedures. As Elena placed her hands on the controls for the first time, she felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft in severe distress, but also sensed the potential for recovery that the civilian pilots had been unable to detect. The Airbus A330 was badly damaged, but it wasn't completely uncontrollable. The moment Elena's hands made contact with the thrust levers, she immediately felt the aircraft fighting desperately for its life. She had perhaps 60 seconds to demonstrate that her combat aviation experience and unconventional recovery techniques could work on a civilian airliner. Captain Mueller, reduce your rudder pressure by exactly half and hold that position steady, she commanded with absolute authority. Lisa, I need continuous altitude and airspeed callouts every 15 seconds. We're going to use differential engine power settings to control our flight path instead of relying on the damaged primary flight controls. Mueller felt the aircraft's flight behavior change almost immediately as Elena began applying incredibly subtle, precise modulations to the engine thrust settings. Instead of the violent, uncontrolled movements they'd been experiencing, the Airbus began responding to control inputs in ways that seemed impossible given the extent of their documented system failures. 12,000 feet, airspeed 285 knots and decreasing steadily, Weber called out, her voice carrying the first hint of hope she'd felt since the emergency began. The aircraft was still falling rapidly toward the ground, but its flight path was becoming significantly more predictable and controllable under Elena's unconventional management. What Elena was accomplishing defied everything that civilian aviation training taught about proper engine management and flight control techniques. She was using rapid, microscopically precise changes in individual engine power output to create differential thrust that functioned essentially like rudder control, while simultaneously using the aircraft's remaining functional trim systems to manage pitch attitude in ways that Airbus designers had never intended or imagined possible. 20 miles away, Major Hans Schmidt was watching Flight 892's flight path with growing amazement from his German Eurofighter Typhoon. The civilian airliner had been in an uncontrolled descent when the military jets first made visual contact, but now it was following a more stable trajectory that suggested someone had regained at least partial control of the aircraft. 10,000 feet, airspeed 270 knots and stabilizing, Weber reported, her voice carrying genuine hope. Rate of descent is decreasing significantly. We're actually approaching something that resembles level flight. Elena continued her precise control inputs while directing Mueller to contact Frankfurt approach. We're going to attempt a straight-in approach to their longest available runway. We won't be able to execute any kind of standard approach pattern, but I believe I can get us lined up for a direct approach if they can clear the entire airspace for us. Flight 892 touched down on Frankfurt's runway 25L at 3:23 p.m. with a smoothness that defied every expectation of anyone who understood the severity of their mechanical failures. The landing was so gentle that passengers initially wondered if they were still airborne, until the familiar sound of reverse thrust and the sight of emergency vehicles racing alongside confirmed that they were safely on German soil. "Ladies and gentlemen," from the flight deck, Elena announced over the cabin address system. "Welcome to Frankfurt International Airport. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened while emergency personnel ensure all aircraft systems are completely secure." The passenger cabin immediately erupted in sustained applause, cheers, and emotional celebrations. People were crying tears of relief, laughing with hysteria and joy, and embracing complete strangers as the overwhelming reality of their survival began to settle into their consciousness. Major Schmidt had landed his Eurofighter and was walking rapidly across the tarmac toward Flight 892 when he received critical information from German Air Force Command. The pilot who just accomplished that impossible recovery, her military call sign is Storm. She's the same pilot who completed that highly classified operation over the Andes Mountains when her aircraft was hit by multiple surface-to-air missiles and she still managed to complete her reconnaissance mission. Schmidt stopped walking abruptly, his expression immediately shifting from professional interest to something approaching deep reverence. Captain Elena Rodriguez, call sign Storm, was already a legend throughout the international NATO aviation community. As Elena emerged from the aircraft, still wearing civilian clothes but now carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of a pilot who had just accomplished something truly extraordinary, Schmidt and his wingman immediately snapped to rigid military attention in a salute that would become one of the most widely photographed moments in modern aviation history. Within minutes, dozens of military aviation experts, commercial airline pilots, and emergency response professionals were standing at attention on the Frankfurt International Airport tarmac, participating in an unprecedented display of respect for a pilot whose skills had just redefined what the aviation community considered possible in civilian emergency situations. She was no longer just Passenger 91. She was Captain Elena Rodriguez, call sign Storm, the pilot who had proven definitively that being consistently underestimated by others could sometimes become the greatest tactical advantage of all. Her story would be told in aviation schools worldwide, not merely as an example of exceptional technical flying skill, but as a powerful reminder that the most extraordinary human capabilities often come disguised in the most unexpected packages.